Greetings everyone, I am Dr. J. If you keep up with the gaming industry at all, then you may have heard some variation of the question, are video games art? To many it seems like a question that doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things, as either it isn't very pertinent or has already been decided by the US Supreme Court. But since it has a habit of showing up every once in a while, let's talk about it. Instead of going through the main talking points, however, I'd like to do something different. For me, art is something that evokes thought or emotion, and as such I find it best to use case studies and examples rather than purely talking about the theoretical. Instead of telling you how video games can be works of art, let's put a laser focus on the game which has had the most influence on my gaming habits, specifically a game that needs no other introduction than this. As the first real-time dungeon crawler, Diablo was a revolutionary game which paved the way for the action RPG to flourish. Though the gameplay is somewhat outdated by modern standards, the memories it created and the legacy it left behind can still be felt to this day. The gameplay made it a critical success, the art direction, atmosphere, story, and so on made it a classic. But how can it be seen as a work of art? To explain that, let's start with what we're most familiar with, the visuals. To that end, we have a medieval/gothic horror setting, but the game doesn't focus on outright scaring you. Instead, it relies on a haunting atmosphere, as you navigate through the underbelly of a corrupted cathedral, ancient catacombs, and dirty caves, eventually leading to hell itself. The most interesting aspect for me is how hell is portrayed. For a place known for fire and brimstone, there's a surprising lack of it. Instead, you're greeted with blood and gore, even more so than the levels above. The walls have giant bones supporting them, there are impaled bodies, bloody remains, and all sorts of grotesque stuff. This change in aesthetic makes the place a lot more threatening from the perspective of the player, as depending on the circumstances, fire can be a mixed signal. It can mean death and destruction, but it can also mean warmth or, in the case of a sorcerer, a purifying light. With gore, any positive connotation it might have had was thrown out the window the moment we're introduced to the butcher.
Fresh meat.
The music does a good job at reinforcing this. The tune you're listening to right now is what plays while you're in town, and if you discard the nostalgia many gamers feel for it, the purpose is to be an anchor throughout the game. As you descend further and further down, the music inside the dungeon grows more sinister and haunting, reflecting how each section is more dangerous than the last. Listening to the entire soundtrack back to back is like a trip down the path of insanity, making every step more foreboding. However, whenever we need to go back, there is always Tristram, and with it comes a feeling of safety, at least for the moment. One of the main misconceptions when it comes to this discussion is that the gameplay commonly gets in the way of the so-called art, but that isn't usually the case. What makes video games unique from other media is their interactivity, and if you're fighting against that in order to create your masterpiece, then there should be a serious conversation as to whether this is really something that should be told in a game to begin with. In many ways, the gameplay is the most essential part, especially where role-playing games are concerned. To bring this back to Diablo, a lot of what makes a good horror setting comes down to what we don't know. As if we aren't sure of what's to come, then we have time for tension to build up so that when something does happen, it will leave a larger impact. In order to help make this impact, the game forces you to deal with a limited line of sight. While in the dungeon, you can only see oh so far around your character, which means that if something is shooting at you from the dark, you can hear the shots being fired and see the projectiles as they try to find their mark, without being able to see who fired them. This alone can add a lot of tension as you either fire blindly in the direction the attacks came from, find a corner to hide and wait for them to show up, or dodge and weave as you try to reach whatever is attacking you. You might be able to hear the monsters, but you don't know what's really out there, how many there are, or if there are any other complications that will get in your way, which further adds to the tense atmosphere. This is further reinforced by the game's procedural generation, which throws a wrench into our ability to predict what will happen. The footage I've recorded for this video is unique in that I don't know where the monsters or loot are, how the dungeon floor will be laid out, which side quests will be available, or where the traps will be. There are certain patterns that you can pick up on after playing the game a lot, but other than that, it's a complete mystery. Because I don't know exactly how many monsters are waiting for me in the next room or are lurking in the dark, there is always a risk of opening a door to be greeted with something you would rather not run into. My dad often jokingly referred to Diablo as the art of running away, because you often find yourself outnumbered, needing to back away to find a bottleneck or other way to handle them all. Those two aspects cover most of the important details, but there are a lot of tropes that exist within RPGs which might clash with the atmosphere the rest of the game wishes to set. Before I tackle the topic directly, it's worth mentioning that pretty much every genre has some sort of trope or convention that wouldn't make sense in reality. You wouldn't expect singing and dancing in most action or gangster movies, but in a musical like West Side Story, no one questions it or asks for more realism. That's not even going into how strange the camera can be when it comes to film or TV. This is a device that can be simultaneously unaware of anything or completely omniscient depending on the circumstances, able to get some really weird perspectives on what's happening, or in some cases act as one of the characters. And yet we don't find that weird because we're used to looking at film and TV shows from all of those perspectives, or none of them as the case may be. To put it simply, tropes are not inherently good or bad and need to be approached on a case-by-case basis. With that in mind, let's put a laser focus on the trope that can seem to clash with the tone the most, the sweet, sweet loot. In a game that tries so hard to be haunting, and in some cases outright scary, why would something like this exist? More often than not, the cool loot is there to make us feel powerful or awesome, and horror settings are all about the unknown, preying on our powerlessness to stop whatever unknown threat is heading our way. However, before you write it off as out of place, think about what most people play games for. To be challenged in some way, and to be successful in that challenge. A well-constructed game will always have something that will act as a compelling reason to keep playing, even if it's not necessarily fun in the traditional sense. To go into more detail, role-playing games originated with the tabletop RPG Dungeons & Dragons, a game in which the focus is on creating our own unique character and taking on a specific role in whatever world has been established. To make the experience compelling, RPGs aim to represent your character's growth, so that as your character experiences more of what the Dungeon Master has crafted, it can be quantified in such a way so as to better connect us to them. Progression systems help a little bit, but loot drops are a more tangible reminder of this. A number may signify an improvement, but a really cool looking or powerful weapon is always going to feel more satisfying to find. Doubly so when the procedural generation makes predicting what you'll get much harder. The power trip that can come with that might be very different in tone to the rest of the game, but the purpose is to make you more invested in the character that you've cultivated, and by proxy, more invested in what happens to that character. In short, you don't want him or her to die because you've come so far with them already. It's the reason why in other games people find the idea of a hardcore character, where if you die once you die for good, so compelling. The idea that so much effort can be lost from one mistake makes the accomplishment when you do succeed feel a lot more satisfying. While Diablo didn't introduce a hardcore mode until its sequel, the same underlying principle is there, that you want to see your character and by proxy yourself succeed. Had Diablo not had the haunting atmosphere and grim world, it would have still been a major success given how innovative its core gameplay was, especially with Blizzard's name backing it up. That being said, what made the game so memorable is how well that setting and art style work with the rest of the game, even in a genre that is often more focused on being fun to play over being artistically valuable. In many ways, it serves as an example that you don't have to sacrifice your artistic expression purely because of gameplay. So the next time you're looking at your favorite game, think about what you're doing and how that affects your view of the game world. You might be surprised by what you find, even in a game about killing monsters and taking their stuff. That's all I have for this video. Thank you all for watching. Please consider liking and sharing this if you find it deserving, and subscribe to this channel for more editorial content as well as other stuff posted on a not so regular basis. Let me know how delusional I am in the comments below, and I will see you all later.